Life is about not knowing, about having to change, about taking the moment and making the best of it without knowing what's going to happen next. And then she said, delicious ambiguity. I like that theme of delicious ambiguity because this morning, as we are in a place in the story where we're on the precipice from the shifting of the people in the wilderness into the land, I want to keep in mind that this transition might be less of an ending and a little bit less tidy than we might have hoped for both then and now. Indeed, we have an advantage because we know how this particular story unfolds. And we are definitely, given our view of history, disabused of the notion that the people's coming into the land is inevitable, easy, or even lasting. In that way, this story reminds us as readers that transitional moments towards the goals to which we aspire, both individually and as groups, often make those goals, well, that history often makes those goals no more than points along the way in a much longer journey that typically keeps us guessing about what will come next. Anybody knows this? You know, you work your whole life towards high school graduation and you think, wow, that's the end all and be all. Well, from our perspective, you know, 40, 50, 60, sometimes 70 years out, you know that was just a point along the way. One of my friends just got tenure and she was like, okay, yay, welcome, I've worked with this my whole life. And then she's like, she looks at me and says, what's next? I'm like, there you go. You spend a long time working for it and then you realize that you're not through yet. So what we carry from these wilderness moments is not only the unsettledness of the challenge, but also the strength that we develop in those circumstances to live our lives in different places. And so one of the more interesting stories in the book of Numbers, the story we're going to consider this morning, I'm doing in honor of June Barrett. This story has to do with 5 women that you may not have heard of until I said so last week. Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, collectively identified as the daughters of Zelophehad. Now, I often wonder, as a biblical scholar, why we don't tell these women's stories more often. Because they show up not once, not twice, but 3 times by name in the book of Numbers. They also show up in Joshua. They also show up in First Chronicles. They're some of the most mentioned women in the Bible. And yet most of us have never heard of them. We first encountered them in an unexpected spot. It's in the middle of the second census taken in the book of Numbers, the census in Numbers 26. Now, if you were here the first week when I was teaching back there, I mentioned that Numbers opens with a census, and as you get near the end, it closes with a census. And the first census is much the same as the second census, but there's a little bit of a difference. The census in Numbers 26 is for this. Moses is instructed, take a census of the whole congregation of the Israelites from 20 years old and up by their ancestral houses, everyone in Israel able to go to war. That's why they took the first census, by the way, because they were planning on coming into the land and moving towards it. They didn't expect to be wandering out in the wilderness for a very long time. But as we know, the wilderness wandering meant that a whole generation passed. God said, not one of you who sets out from this place is going to go into that land except for Joshua and Caleb. Every one of that first generation is going to die. A new generation is going to be who comes into that land. So they had to take another census. This census we would expect is going to be of the men because they're looking for fighters, right? That's what they said. Who's ready to go to war? But the fact that these 5 show up means that we are not just at the beginning of a new generation, but we're also at the beginning of a different way of doing things. This is what it says in Numbers 26. Now Zelophehad, son of Hefer, had no sons, only daughters. And the names of the daughters of Zelophehad were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. That's curiosity enough in the middle of a census of men that the writers and editors knew they had to follow that up. So chapter 27 tells their story. And what we get in chapter 27 is interesting. These daughters are again introduced to us in 2 ways. The first way is through their father's line. And this time we get it a little bit more completely. Zelophehad was son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the clans of Manasseh, sons of Joseph. And then once again, we are given their birth names. I'm not going to repeat them all again. Now, this first framing in the family line is really important because it is the father's line who gives them identity in the community. Daughters, until their marriage, were known by the house of their father. That designation would indicate a lot of things in that community. Who was responsible for their upkeep? Who was responsible for their safety? With whom you had to deal if you wanted to marry one of them? And who you would have to confront should one of them come to harm. So this was an identifier of whose people they belonged to. Those women would also have been socialized to have a sense of responsibility toward that household. Not only because it kept them safe, but also because if they were to act in a way that was outside of the community norms, they would bring shame to every person in that household and shame to the name of their father. You might think of a Jane Austen novel in that regard, right? You know, I remember Pride and Prejudice when Lydia runs off and marries the guy, well, doesn't marry the guy. They have to arrange for the marriage. And they're like, oh no, her mother's panicked. How will any of my daughters ever have a good marriage with our family name being shamed in that way? Remember that? I'm a big Pride and Prejudice fan. So anyway, they also know that if they act honorably out in the community, it's honor to the household and honor to the name of the father. This is the way those communities function. In addition, I want to point out that it's important that they are identified by their given names. Women's names are rare in the Bible. By one estimate, there are just under 3,100 names in the Bible. And some 2,900 of those are men in comparison to 170 women. Another calculation said there are 1,700 distinct personal names in the Bible, and 1,563 of those are men and 137 women. No matter who's doing the counting and how they count, when it comes down to personal names, the number of women counted is somewhere between 5 and 8% of the total. Nowhere representative of the over half of the population that women are. Thus, when we get these women names by their first name, we should sit up and pay attention because the writers and editors are telling us not just once, but multiple times, these women are important and their story should be memorialized. The first verb that describes their action in the text is kara, or draw near. It is a verb that is used often for coming into the presence of the divine. So what we hear is the daughters of the Zelophehad, these 5 names, drew near. And where did they draw near to? Well, verse 2 tells us they stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all of the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Now, I want you to notice 3 things about that verse. Number 1 is their action. When one draws near and takes a stand, you are seeking to be seen. This is a very public space. The desire to be noticed then should have a clear purpose, and in fact, they do have a reason that they want everybody to see them. When I was thinking about being seen, having 5 women who are accustomed not to be seen, put themselves in a position for the whole community to have eyes on them. I thought this morning about the women in the streets of Iran. You may not have been following this story, but Masa Amini, who is 22, was taken into custody some days back by the Guidance Patrol, or the group that enforces the Iranian government's moral protocols. She was getting off the subway, and all the video shows she was wearing appropriately loose clothing and a headscarf. But when these men who are given this authority see a woman, they can pull you in for an infraction as slight as having a wisp of hair showing outside of your headscarf, or a garment that's slightly too tight that might show an outline of your body. This woman died while she was in their custody, and now what we are seeing is street riots, not only in Tehran, but around the country. Women are burning their head scars and openly defying the norms that led her to be killed. And they are doing so because they think she was doing nothing wrong, and they want to be seen as protesting. When you make a choice like the daughters of Zelophehad did, you want to be seen because you don't think you're doing anything that is wrong. So the number 1 thing I want you to do is notice the action they're taking. I also want you to notice their audience. First mentioned is Moses. This has got to be nerve-wracking on a level all its own. He was the first man who was called by God to bring the people out of Egypt. He was reputed to talk to God face to face. And these new generation of women, grew up hearing stories about him and seeing him at the head of everything. It would be like the audience with Queen Elizabeth II or the Pope. Something that's just like, wow, how did the ordinary old me end up here? But it's not just Moses, it's Eleazar, the top priest. Aaron is dead at this point, and the other leaders, and the entirety of the people. You have a very public audience. So I thought this week about that too. And it made me think back to the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. I wonder how much all of those ministers and speakers and leaders practiced. Because I know if it were me being called up to read a passage in the Bible or to have to deliver her sermon, I would not want to screw it up in front of the king, the royal family, every world leader gathered to honor her, and an audience of millions, if not billions, on television worldwide. Can you imagine how nerve-wracking it would be? So they have that kind of audience here. And the third thing that I want you to notice is the place. They are at the door of the tent of meeting. It's the place where God comes down to dwell, the threshold of where the divine and the human intersect. It's the place where you go to encounter the holy and the sanctified, but it's also the place from which the ruling of God come forth. So when I was trying to figure out how to explain this one, I thought about my own experiences. I was called for jury duty. And so I take myself down to the courthouse, and most of you probably been in that dank basement room in the courthouse, and you watched the video, like, this is why it's so important that you're here to be a juror. And I watched the video, and I got my parking validated, and then I got called upstairs with a group of about 30 people to interview or to be questioned to sit on a jury. And so the judge, very nice young woman, and she was young and she was a woman, explained jury duty, and then she told us that this particular case was going to last 2 or 3 days beyond the day that I was called. And jury service can bring for the day and done unless you get seated. And she said, does anybody have a reason to be deferred? And I raised my hand because I couldn't be gone for 3 days right now. And so she invited me to come forward and had to step up, stand before the judge and explain why you needed to be deferred. Now, I speak publicly all the time. I mean, that courtroom was a little bit unfamiliar. I'm standing before a judge who's in her robe, and you've got the lawyers and the defendant and all these people in there, and you're like, okay, really, I have an excuse, and I'm glad to serve, just not for 3 days right now. And so I did get deferred. But I understand why these women might be a little nervous. There is, and my experience is nothing in comparison to theirs. Because number one, we also have to realize something else about these women. They're young. None of them are married. We'll find that out for sure later on. None of them are married, which means they're very young. So you might say, well, they're a little reckless, but these very young women are standing in a very important place, and they are speaking in a time when women didn't often speak publicly. I could just set up for these women. So, with all of these factors at play, I have to say I find these 5 sisters impressive. Even more so because they state their case succinctly and boldly. I think they practice. They say, first of all, our father died in the wilderness. In this world where women are defined in relationship to men, usually, again, the father before marriage and the husband afterwards, these women appear to be alone in the next generation, the one coming into the land. But they understand something about what they need to prove about their father, because the next thing out of their mouth is this: he was not among the congregation of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the congregation of Korah, but he died for his own sin. We can go over the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram here. It's in number 16 if you want to read it. But suffice it to say, this was no run-of-the-mill challenge to Moses' authority. Korah, the leader, was making the assertion that all the congregation are holy, every one of them, as demonstrated by the fact that the Lord is amongst all of the people, and then asked Moses, so why should you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord? He was making the claim that Moses was taking advantage of the people. He had 250 leaders behind him, and the people as a whole, as a big whole, a lot of the people rebelled with them. Moses went on in that story to prove that God was on his side, and the rebellion was put down. But these women wanted the congregation to know our Father who did die in the wilderness, was on the side that he should have been. And then they had one more thing, and he had no sons. That last thing is important because he had nobody from the male line to have his portion in the land. And so they are the only voice he has to speak on his behalf. Now, I moved slowly and carefully because I wanted you to know that these 5 women are as respectful of their circumstance as anybody could possibly be in the circumstances. I want to say something about that because it's important to know. Some of you may be familiar with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who's one of my favorite commentators. He died in 2020 of cancer, but he was a rabbi in the United Kingdom, a writer and theologian. And he says, you know, he was writing about actually the rebellion of Korah when he said, it's not that Korah disagreed with Moses that was the problem. Disagreement is not a problem in Jewish tradition. We love an argument. He said, Jewish tradition is all about an argument. We love a counterpoint. But he said the problem was that when they had these rebellions, they weren't what he calls on the side of heaven. Rather, they were about personal ambition and not about what was best for all. And the distinction he makes is this. He says, an argument not for the sake of heaven is one that is undertaken for the sake of victory. An argument for the sake of heaven is undertaken for the sake of truth. When the aim is victory, as was in the case of Korah, both sides are diminished. Korah died and Moses' authority was tarnished. But when the aim is truth, both sides gain. To be defeated by the truth is the only defeat that is also a victory. Now, why I raise that here is because these women are arguing with the norm in a way that is after truth, not their own gain. Thus, they continue. Why should the name of our Father be taken away from his plan because he has no son? Why shouldn't we remember that our Father existed, that he was a part of this community, that he was faithful to this people just because he doesn't have a male heir? That's the question that sets everything up. Pretty bold, isn't it? And then they turn around and they say, give, and that is an inheritance, us a possession among our father's brothers. We want to inherit. The 5 of us girls standing here. Are they young and reckless? You gotta know, only young girls would be there. I mean, given the way that anything that goes against the norm has been framed in the book of Numbers, one might expect the earth to open up and swallow them whole like it did Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Now, I need a minute to talk about what might have motivated their request. Women not in relationship to a man, a father, a husband, a brother, a male relation, did not have an easy situation. They couldn't have an easy situation. That's because they were outside of the social order, which was established around this idea of the house of the father and passed through the male line. Thus, to sustain themselves, to protect themselves, and to find a way through the culture, they needed to be attached to a man. I'll give you a familiar story. Ruth and Naomi, also written in the post-exilic period about this time. Do you remember? Naomi's husband died, so the father said. Both of her sons died. So all we got left is this woman and her two daughters-in-law. And Naomi's like, hey, we're going to starve, we're going to die, this isn't good. And even when Ruth goes back with her to the land, what is she doing to eat? She's gleaning behind in wherever she can find to just grab food. Women didn't have it easy. They were often harassed. They were often assaulted. They were often left to ends that were not good, unless they could find attachment to a man. And thus, these women understood that once this wilderness encampment breaks apart and everybody gets their little portion of the land, they didn't have anywhere to go. And their fathers men didn't have anywhere to rest. They saw that clearly. Thus, they have a fighting spirit. That's why I think they're actually in Numbers 26, the census of the fighters. Because they demonstrate a willingness to fight for the land, even if it's not to go out there and, battle armor, full on Mel Gibson Braveheart style. They are using their voices to fight for what they think they deserve. I like Moses' reaction. Moses, we're told, doesn't hesitate. He takes their case to the Lord, and he comes back from God virtually immediately with this pronouncement. The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying, says the Lord. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers, and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. By all accounts, it's a bit of a shocker. Women inheriting property? How does that happen? Moreover, it doesn't end there. Moses continues. God says, you shall speak to the Israelites, saying, if a man dies and he has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, you shall give inheritance to his father's brothers. And if the father has no brothers, then you shall give it to the nearest kinsman, and he will possess it. This is a statute and ordinance as the Lord commanded Moses. Okay, so maybe the women only get it in one generation, but they still get it. And this doesn't just apply to these 5 women, it applies to the people of Israel. So celebration ensues, right? Well, maybe. Never quite so easy. You see, there are 2 outcomes for this story in the biblical text, and how they relate, we're not sure. In Judges 17, after they come into the land, we read about its allotment, and they get around to Manasseh and the tribes of Joseph. And it says, now Zelophehad, son of Pepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, had no sons but only daughters. And these are the names of his daughters, Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They came before the priest Eleazar and Joshua, remember Moses couldn't get to go over. And the leaders, and they said, the Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance along with our male kin. So according to the commandment of Moses, of the Lord, he gave an inheritance among the kinsmen. Thus there fell to Manasseh 10 portions, beside the land of Gilead and Bashan, which is on the other side of the Jordan, because the daughters of Manasseh received an inheritance along with his son. So you think, okay, problem solved. Except Numbers chapter 36. You see, his daughters caught some of the other men unawares. They weren't expecting these girls to go up to the tent of meeting to get this judgment and to have it pronounced. So they go to the tent of meeting before Moses and the leaders, described as the heads of the ancestral houses. And they said, well, the Lord commanded for this inheritance by the lot of the Israelites to our brothers Zelophehad and his daughters. But if they get married into another tribe, then our inheritance is going to go with that tribe, and it's going to mess everything up. Because the land's not going to be apportioned the way that it ought to be. And when the Jubilee comes around, that land is lost to us forever. So the text says, okay, well, they're right too. So then Moses commands these women, you can marry anybody you want to. Almost sounds like a big fat Greek wedding. As long as they're from the right tribe. So you got a limited field to play with. And then we are told that the daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord commanded Moses. Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah married sons of their father's brothers. They were married into the clans of the descendants of Manasseh, and their inheritance remained in the tribe of their father's clan. We don't get in this story to land-owning women. Oh well. Free to marry who they want to, or free not to marry if they so choose. Still, I think there's some great things to carry away from their story, and we should celebrate. And when I was thinking about how to talk about that, what we could carry forward in my last 10 minutes, who came to mind was Maggie Coon. Anybody know who Maggie Coon is? I've got big Presbyterians in here, you ought to. Okay. Maggie Coon was already a seasoned professional when she started working for the Presbyterian Church USA in 1948 at age 43. At the Presbyterian Board of Christian Education's Department of Social Education and Action, she edited what was a journal named Social Progress, and she oversaw community relations and social welfare programs, and she consulted with women's groups. At least she did until 1970, when she turned 65 and she was forced to retire by law. That was the law. And that didn't just apply to women, it applied to everybody. You had to retire when you were 65. Maggie Coon, in a later reflection on how she experienced that forced retirement, said, I suddenly felt wounded and angry at having been sent out to pasture to get lost. Then I figured there must be thousands of old people just like me, and I decided it was time for us to fight back. She founded the Gray Campus. It was an organization that pushed back not only against forced retirement, and you may know that in 1986, they finally signed a law. Ronald Reagan, then the oldest president of the United States, signed it into law that did not force people to retire anymore unless you were in certain professions. Like you can't be an air traffic controller after a certain age, that makes sense. But most professions like mine, you could work till you drop, and that's just fine. But they also worked against ageist stereotypes and against things like cuts to Medicare and Social Security. She was the grassroots that led to the AARP. That's what this woman did. And one of her quotes about how to live out a life that stands against wrong things might be a little bit familiar to you, at least in part, but it reminds me of Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. So I want to take her quote as what we walk away with from today, and I'm going to take it in pieces. First, she said, leave safety behind. Check for those women. They could have just let circumstances be what they were and figured we have to live with the status quo. Easy enough for most of us to do, right? I can't do anything about it. It's just me. But they chose differently. In fact, those 5 women did what Coon advises next. Put your body on the line. She was saying what those 5 women understood. If you want change, you cannot sit and expect it just to happen. You've got to be willing to get out there. That point to me is a really hard one today, because I work with the generation that thinks if I click, thumbs down on my social media, I've taken action. And it's like, no, not exactly. When you think about people who take action, I think about these Iranians in the street. I think about these Ukrainians fighting for their country. I think about these Russians, not the ones who've gone to Finland, but the ones who are out there getting arrested in the streets going, no to this threat. Put your body on the line. Kuhn continues. This is the part of the quote you might know. Stand before the people you fear and speak your mind, even if your voice shakes. Stand before the people you fear and speak your mind, even if your voice shakes. It is a completely human moment for your fear, for your anxiety, for your emotion to be heard in the trembling of your voice, isn't it? I'm one who, I can cry at the drop of a hat. And when I get really raw, people don't understand this about me. I cry when I'm happy. I cry when I'm sad. I cry when I'm joyous. I cry when I'm in agony. I cry when I'm excited. And so my voice will shake quite a bit. But she's telling us, don't let yourself worry about that. She says, you need to say what you need to say. Because she moves on to remind us, when you least expect it, someone may actually listen to what you have to say. Well-aimed slingshots can topple giants. There's for David and Goliath metaphor. These women may not have expected much. They might not have expected much, but they were heard. And while their ask did not transform the reality for all women in Israel across all time, it changed the reality for many of them. And what's really interesting is if you look in 1 Chronicles chapter 7 when they're mentioned, all of a sudden these genealogies in 1 Chronicles don't just include men, they include women. And you have to think, by God, hey girls, good for you. You got that out there. And the last point she makes, Kuhn does, she says, and do your homework. I think about how smart these 5 young women were. They understood the power structure. They understood how to make an argument that could be heard by the power structure. And they knew how to act for something that was fair. No more, no less. The scrappiness of these daughters of Zelophehad, I say, is a quality forged in wilderness. It got them, and many women after them, counted amongst the people of Israel. It is a great wilderness quality that we ought to carry with us, even in times that seem settled, because it was that very scrappiness that they were going to need to survive in the land. Now, before you ask, and I know you will, we don't know what happens to them. We don't hear who they marry. We don't hear who their children are. But we hear their names over and over and over again. I think they deserve a stained glass window or two in our pantheon of great characters in the book of Numbers. Anybody got a question? June, Bill Noble, NOH. So that was, yeah, it could go either way, no law. Anybody? Do you love them? Yeah, right.
Sandie, I have 2 sisters. Growing up after the Depression, WW2, my sister did what I did. The work. No doubt, these 5 women picked up the mantle of it, if had been males in the family, and did what had to be done.
I think what's really interesting about this, Ralph, too, is something that one of my professors, Carol Myers at Duke, I think she's retired now, would say about women. What we know of women in agricultural economies, which is what this was when they came in, is that women do about 40% of the hard labor of agricultural economy. The reason it's not 50-50, because women also give birth and raise the children. And so that is where that decline comes in terms of the distribution of labor. So I kind of think it ends up, not all that unbalanced, given that you have to have babies and raise those too. So yeah, I think it's not just our generation of women, but it's generations of women who have contributed all along to the peoples and to the foundation and survival of this nation. And what was really interesting about this is that while it's set in the wilderness settlement period, like I told you all along, it's really more about the post-exilic period. And guess what? We don't see women entering into, say, the priesthood, but we do start to see women doing things like taking over the running of synagogues. Synagogues have managers to keep their affairs. Women did that job even in the ancient world. And we have evidence of that. So you begin to see some of these barriers coming down.
I'm thinking of change now. Now the men want to be women.
There's
a lot of that going on.
There is a lot of that going on, but nonetheless, I think it's a great story. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
But the National Society of Daughters of the American Revolution have now started seeking out female patrons. Oh, and are now finally honoring some of the wives of some people in French.
Yeah, and I think what historians will tell you is a lot of women fought. I mean, it's like some of them, of course, kept the home while men went away, which was a job in and of itself in an agricultural economy. But we also had evidence that a number of women were in the camps and did fight. And so this is, again, part of our history that we don't altogether know. And that when we romanticize this sort of idea of strict gender roles, we lose. Yeah.
My younger sister thought that women ought to be drafted the same as men.
Well, all my Israeli friends will tell you, they do their service. Now they do less service than men do. Their time limit is a little bit shorter. But women are in the Israeli military. And some of this dates back to these traditions. Well, I didn't do this last week. I hope you did. And I look forward to seeing you in Gravett.
Thank you so much. There are some stories that we were not familiar with. We've learned, and we've also hit the thing. We appreciate that and look forward to the next 2 months. Anything else needs to be said? Don't forget the rollers up here. I'll follow around and add things that don't see on there. But if you're here, please check in them all. I will close with a very quick Irish lesson. It almost seems trite until you get to the last sentence. He who loses money loses much. He who loses a friend loses more. He who loses faith loses everything. So,